There is a wall above Cusco, Peru, that has survived every earthquake strong enough to level colonial cathedrals built 500 years after it. Stone blocks the size of delivery trucks, some weighing more than 100 tons, sit locked together with no mortar, no cement, nothing holding them but their own shape. You cannot slide a knife blade into most of the seams. Engineers have modeled it with modern seismic software just to understand why, after centuries of violent shaking that has flattened churches and mansions around it, this wall is still standing exactly where it was built. And the honest answer is stranger and more interesting than any myth about ancient aliens. The people who built it weren't primitive. They may have understood earthquake engineering better than we did for most of modern history. The site is called Sacsayhuaman, and it sits on a ridge above the old Inca capital, roughly 12,000 feet above sea level, where the air is thin enough to make a newcomer's lungs ache within minutes of climbing the stairs. 3 massive walls run along the ridge in a jagged zigzag that stretches almost 400 meters, stacked terrace above terrace, looking from the air like the teeth of a great stone jaw. Up close, the scale is disorienting. Some blocks rise taller than a person standing beside them. The largest stones at the site are estimated to weigh somewhere between 120 and 200 tons, depending on which block researchers are measuring, numbers so large that comparing them to trucks and whales has become almost a cliche in every documentary about the place. But the weight isn't actually the strangest part. The strange part is the shape. Look at these blocks individually, and you will not find a single cube, a single rectangle, a single tidy brick-like form anywhere in the lower coarse geometry, with faces meeting at odd angles, knobs projecting outward in places, notches carved to receive the neighboring stone, and edges that curve rather than run straight. This style is called polygonal masonry, and Sacsayhuaman contains some of the finest examples of it anywhere on Earth. Thousands of blocks, no 2 of them alike, and yet every one of them interlocks with the stones around it so precisely that the wall reads as one continuous surface rather than a pile of separate pieces. That precision is not folklore. It has been measured, photographed, and studied by structural engineers, not just admired by tourists, pressing a piece of paper into a seam and finding it won't fit. A team of researchers publishing in the Journal of Cultural Heritage in 2024 modeled a section of the Sacsayhuaman wall using rigid body dynamics inside a finite element framework, essentially treating each stone as an individual solid object and simulating how the whole assembly responds to seismic shaking. Their goal wasn't mysticism, it was practical. Preservation engineering, because parts of these walls have experienced tilting and settlement problems over the centuries, and modern conservators need to understand the structure's real mechanical behavior if they want to protect it. What that kind of analysis confirms is something local guides have said for years in less technical language. The wall doesn't resist an earthquake by being rigid. It resists by being able to move. To understand why that matters, you need to understand where Cusco sits on the map of the planet's violence. The Andes exist because the Nazca Oceanic Plate is sliding beneath the South American continental building mountains and triggering earthquakes for millions of years and shows no sign of stopping. Cusco lies close enough to active fault systems that serious earthquakes are not a rare event in its history. They are a recurring one. The region absorbed a major earthquake in 1650 that damaged much of the colonial city. It was struck again in 1950 by a quake that toppled church towers, cracked colonial facades, and killed dozens of people in and around Cusco. In both cases, contemporary accounts and later surveys noted the same pattern. The Spanish colonial buildings, built with mortar and squared masonry in the European style, suffered severe damage, while the Inca stonework beneath and around them remained largely intact. This isn't an internet legend. It's documented in architectural and engineering surveys of Cusco's earthquake history. And it is one of the reasons Peruvian authorities have taken genuine scientific interest in reverse engineering exactly how Inca Masons achieved this kind of seismic resilience. The mechanism the finite element study points toward is the same one masonry engineers see in other successful ancient seismic designs around the world, from Japanese timber pagodas to the base isolation techniques used in some ancient Greek temples. Rigidity is not always your friend when the ground starts moving. A wall built as one solid, perfectly squared, mortared unit has nowhere to release the energy an earthquake pumps into it. Stress concentrates at weak points, cracks form, and once a crack starts, it propagates catastrophically. A wall built from many individually shaped stones, fitted tightly but not cemented together, behaves more like a system of interlocking parts than a single rigid slab. Under shaking, individual blocks can shift by small amounts, rock slightly against their neighbors, and redistribute the load, then settle back close to their original position once the shaking stops. The stones absorb and dissipate seismic energy through tiny, controlled movements, instead of concentrating it into one. Catastrophic failure point. It is, in a functional sense, an ancient form of what modern engineers call base isolation or energy dissipation design, discovered independently by builders working with hammerstones and immense patience rather than accelerometers and finite element software. The irregular interlocking shape of each stone is what makes that movement possible. If every stone were a flat brick, the wall would essentially be one rigid mass wearing a decorative skin, because each stone has a unique, multi-faced geometry that grips its neighbors in 3 dimensions, not just at the visible outer surface, but often at hidden interior contact points as well. The wall behaves more like a system of nested joints than a solid block. Some of the largest and most famous individual stones at Cusco display this complexity dramatically. The most well-known example, embedded in a wall, a short walk from Sacsayhuaman itself, is a single boulder cut with 12 distinct angled faces, each one meeting a different neighboring stone at a different angle, a level of geometric complexity that would be difficult to design and cut correctly, even with computer-aided drafting tools, let alone with stone hammers and rope. So how did they actually cut and place stones like this without iron tools, without the wheel used for load transport, without horses or oxen to haul with? This is where the historical record and the archaeological evidence actually agree closely, and where there is far less mystery than viral videos suggest, even though what remains is still an extraordinary feat of organized labor. The stone itself came from nearby quarries, the most significant being Rumicolca, roughly 35 kilometers from Cusco, which supplied much of the andesite used across the Inca capital, along with closer limestone sources used for parts of Sacsayhuaman's construction. Quarrying began by identifying natural fractures and weak planes in the rock face, then working wooden wedges, sometimes soaked with water to expand and split the stone along those planes, combined with controlled use of fire and rapid cooling to encourage cracking, a technique documented in stoneworking traditions across multiple ancient cultures. Once a rough block was freed from the quarry face, the truly grinding work began, shaping it using hammerstones, typically harder, river cobbles or hematite nodules, struck against the softer quarried stone again and again to remove material and rough out the block's approximate form. Recreations by archaeologists and engineers, including experimental work associated with organizations like the World Monuments Fund, have confirmed this process works and that it is exactly as slow and physically brutal as it sounds. Finer shaping and the final fitting of interlocking faces likely involved a combination of continued percussion with smaller hammerstones and abrasive grinding, using sand, water, and harder stone tools dragged repeatedly across the surface, a technique that leaves the smoothed, faintly striated finish visible on many of the site's best preserved faces, distinct from the pitted texture left by pure hammering. Moving stones of this size from quarry to construction site, sometimes over distances of many kilometers and up steep mountain terrain, required a logistical operation on a genuinely massive scale. Spanish chroniclers who arrived in the 16th century, including G. Pedro Chiesa de Leon, and later the mestizo historian Garcilaso de la Vega, recorded oral accounts and second-hand descriptions from Inca, informants describing enormous labor gangs, sometimes cited in the thousands of workers, hauling blocks using thick ropes, wooden rollers, log rails, and earthen ramps, built and then dismantled as construction progressed. These accounts describe the process as dangerous and occasionally fatal, with chroniclers recording stories of stones breaking loose and crushing workers during transport, a detail that has the ring of eyewitness memory rather than flattering legend. This labor was organized through the MITA system, a form of rotational mandatory public service that every subject community within the Inca Empire owed to the state, which allowed Cusco's rulers to mobilize huge coordinated workforces for major infrastructure projects like roads, terracing, and monumental construction, without a monetary economy or standing professional construction guild in the way we'd think of one today. This is, in itself, a remarkable administrative and engineering achievement, arguably more impressive than any individual stone, an empire capable of planning, provisioning, and coordinating tens of thousands of laborers across a mountain landscape without wheeled vehicles, draft animals, or a written numerical system beyond the knotted cord records called quipu. Once blocks reached the construction site, the final and most technically demanding step was fitting each irregular stone precisely against its neighbors. Archaeologists and stonemasons who have studied the technique believe this was likely achieved through a repeated trial and adjustment process, where a new block would be set against the stones already in place, its contact surfaces marked or tested, then removed and ground down slightly at the high points, then reset and tested again, repeated as many times as necessary until the fit was essentially seamless. This is painstaking iterative work, closer to hand fitting a machined part than casually stacking rocks, and it explains why polygonal Inca masonry looks the way it does. Not decorative flourish, but the visible result of a repeatable fitting method applied with extraordinary discipline across an enormous structure. Sacsayhuaman itself was never simply a wall. Archaeological consensus describes it as a major ceremonial and administrative complex, as much as a defensive structure, likely serving multiple roles simultaneously, something common at major Inca sites, where military, religious, and political functions deliberately woven together rather than separated. Excavations at the site have also revealed that Sacsayhuaman was not purely an Inca creation from nothing. In 2008, archaeologists uncovered remains beneath the site belonging to the earlier Quilque culture, including an 11-room structure indicating the ridge held significance in earlier construction before the Inca state expanded and rebuilt monumentally on top of it, a pattern of layered occupation common across the Andes. The famous zigzag shape of the three main walls is generally interpreted as serving a dual purpose. Defensively, the jagged angles would have exposed the flanks of any attacking force attempting to scale them. Terraces, denying them a flat, easily defended approach. While symbolically and visually the pattern has long been associated by researchers and local tradition with the shape of a puma, an animal of major significance in Inca cosmology, with Cusco itself reportedly planned in the rough outline of a puma's body, Sacsayhuaman forming its head or crown on the hill above the city. The historical record for the site takes a darker turn after 1532, when Spanish forces under Francisco Pizarro arrived in the Andes and began the conquest of the Inca Empire. Sacsayhuaman was the site of a major and bloody battle in 1536, when Inca forces under Manco Inca Yupanqui besieged Spanish-held Cusco and used the fortress as a stronghold in the fighting, a battle chronicled in some detail by contemporary Spanish accounts. After the conquest was consolidated, Spanish colonists began systematically dismantling parts of Sacsayhuaman, removing smaller stones to use as building material for churches, mansions, and other structures being raised in colonial Cusco below. This is a documented and significant reason the site looks smaller and less complete today than it did in the 16th century, and it means we are looking at a structure that has already lost an unknown quantity of its original stonework, taken apart stone by stone rather than destroyed all at once. What has survived, though, has survived spectacularly well, and that durability is exactly what has made the site a genuine subject of ongoing structural engineering research, rather than only tourism and speculation. The 2024 seismic study is part of a broader, serious scientific interest in understanding traditional Andean stone construction as a source of real earthquake-resilient design principles, not folklore to be marveled at, but engineering knowledge that might actually inform how we build and retrofit structures in seismically active regions today. Researchers modeling these walls are not trying to solve a supernatural mystery. They are trying to extract a working understanding of load distribution, joint behavior, and dynamic response from a structure that has already passed centuries of real-world seismic testing more successfully than most modern buildings ever will. That's also why it's worth being careful about how this story gets told. In recent years, a wave of online videos and articles have framed sites like Sacsayhuaman as evidence of some vanished super technology, hinting at forgotten tools, lost civilizations, or even claiming that artificial intelligence has recently uncovered secret, inexplicable patterns in the stonework that mainstream science supposedly can't explain. It's worth saying plainly that no credible published research has used an AI system to reveal some hidden new capability behind these walls that overturns the archaeological record. What real researchers have done, using laser scanning, photogrammetry, and computational modeling, has confirmed and refined what specialists already understood about Inca stoneworking rather than replacing it with something more exotic. The actual findings are, if anything, more impressive than the myth because they credit real human beings, using real tools, organized through a real and sophisticated state bureaucracy, with solving one of the hardest problems in structural engineering centuries before anyone had the mathematics to describe why their solution worked. That is really the heart of what makes Sacsayhuaman worth talking about honestly rather than mystically. This wasn't luck, and it wasn't some inexplicable ancient wisdom beamed in from nowhere. It was the product of generations of accumulated trial, failure, and refinement, exactly the kind of iterative engineering knowledge that any long-lived technical tradition builds up over time, then passes down through trained specialists, master masons teaching apprentices a repeatable method rather than each worker improvising from scratch. The consistency visible across thousands of unique stones, the repeating structural logic in how faces meet and interlock, the specific finishing techniques that show up again and again across the site, all point toward a trained workforce following a shared, deliberately taught methodology, not scattered individual craftsmen each solving the same puzzle independently by luck. And then, abruptly, that knowledge stopped being transmitted. The Spanish conquest didn't just physically dismantle parts of the fortress, it dismantled the social and political structure, the Mittal labor system, and the master-apprentice knowledge chains that had made large-scale Inca stonework possible in the first place. Within a couple of generations, the specific hands-on expertise required to quarry, shape, and fit stone at this level of precision had largely disappeared, not because the knowledge was inherently unwritable or mystical, but because the institutions and living tradition that carried it forward were violently interrupted. That is arguably the most sobering part of the Sacsayhuaman story. Not that we can't explain how it was built, because in broad strokes we actually can, but that an entire sophisticated engineering tradition, developed over centuries and capable of building structures that still outperform much of what came after it, was lost within living memory of the people who mastered it, and has never fully been recovered since. Today, Sacsayhuaman remains one of the most visited archaeological sites in Peru, drawing millions of travelers who come to walk along the same zigzag terraces, press their fingers into seams too tight for a blade, and stand beneath stones heavier than loaded trucks that have shrugged off 5 centuries of earthquakes that leveled buildings built with what we like to think of as more advanced technology. Ongoing conservation work continues at the site, informed directly by the kind of structural modeling described earlier, because understanding exactly how these walls move and settle under stress is essential to keeping them standing for future generations, rather than assuming their past survival guarantees their future. Other major Inca sites, including Ollantaytambo and the walls beneath colonial Cusco itself, still hold unexcavated sections and unanswered structural questions of their own, and Peruvian and international researchers continue actively surveying them using the same modern tools, laser scanning, photogrammetry, and computational seismic modeling, not to manufacture mystery, but to genuinely understand what earlier generations of Indian engineers already knew. If there's a real lesson standing on that ridge above Cusco, it isn't that ancient people needed help from somewhere else to achieve something this advanced. It's that human ingenuity, organized at scale and refined over generations, is consistently underestimated by people looking backward from a position of assumed technological superiority. The Inca didn't need lasers to understand how to build something that resists earthquakes. They needed centuries of hard-won trial and error, a workforce capable of extraordinary discipline, and a system for passing hard-earned technical knowledge from one generation of builders to the next. That system works so well, its results are still standing after 500 years of the exact violence it was built to survive. The mystery was never how it was possible. The mystery is how completely we managed to forget that it was. There's a wall above Cusco, Peru, that has survived every earthquake strong enough to level colonial cathedrals built 500 years after it. Stone blocks the size of delivery trucks, some weighing more than 100 tons, sit locked together with no mortar, no cement, nothing holding them. But their own shape. You cannot slide a knife blade into most of the seams, and the honest answer for why it has survived is stranger and more interesting than any myth about ancient aliens. The people who built it weren't primitive. They may have understood earthquake engineering better than we did for most of modern history. The site is called Sacsayhuaman, sitting on a ridge above the old Inca capital at roughly 12,000 feet, where 3 massive walls run in a jagged zigzag stretching nearly 400 meters, stacked terrace above terrace like the teeth of a stone jaw. Some blocks rise taller than a person. The large are estimated at between 120 and 200 tons. But the weight isn't the strangest part. The strangest part is the shape. Every stone is irregular, many-sided, with faces meeting at odd angles, knobs and notches carved to receive the next block, edges that curve rather than run straight. Thousands of blocks, no two alike, and every one interlocks so precisely the wall reads as a single continuous surface rather than a pile of separate pieces. That precision has been measured, not just admired. In 2024, researchers publishing in the Journal of Cultural Heritage modeled a section of the wall using rigid body dynamics inside a finite element framework, treating each stone as an individual solid object to simulate how the whole structure responds to seismic shaking. Their goal was practical preservation engineering, since parts of the walls have experienced settlement problems over the centuries. What the modeling confirms is what local guides have said for years in plainer language. The wall doesn't survive earthquakes by being rigid, it survives by being able to move. That matters because Cusco sits close to active fault systems along the Andes, where the Nazca Oceanic Plate slides beneath the South American continental plate. The region absorbed a major earthquake in 1650, and another in 1950 that toppled colonial church towers and cracked mortared facades across the city. In both cases, the pattern was the same. Spanish colonial buildings built with mortar and squared stone suffered severe damage, while the Inca stonework around and beneath them remained largely intact. That contrast is documented in architectural surveys of Cusco's earthquake history, and it's a major reason researchers have taken serious interest in reverse engineering exactly how Inca masons pulled this off. The mechanism resembles something modern engineers call base isolation. A rigid, mortared wall has nowhere to release the energy an earthquake pumps into it, so stress concentrates and cracks propagate catastrophically. A wall built from many individually shaped stones, fitted tightly but not cemented. behaves more like a system of interlocking parts. Under shaking, block. Chaos shift slightly, rock against their neighbors, redistribute the load, and settle back close to their original position once the shaking stops. Each stone's unique multi-faced geometry is what makes that possible, gripping its neighbors in 3 dimensions, often at hidden interior contact points. Novae, cedar will ever see. The most famous example of that complexity is a single boulder near the site cut with 12 distinct angled faces, each meeting a different neighbor at a different angle, a level of geometric planning that would be demanding even with modern drafting tools. So how did they cut and place stones like this without iron tools, wheeled transport, or draft animals? The record here is less mysterious than viral videos suggest, even though the achievement remains extraordinary. Stone was quarried at sites like Rumicolca, roughly 35 kilometers away, split along natural fracture lines using wooden wedges and controlled heating, then shaped by direct percussion with harder hammerstones, a slow and physically brutal process confirmed by modern experimental archaeology. Finer surfaces were smoothed through abrasive grinding with sand and water. Moving the blocks required a labor force organized through the Amita system, a rotational public service obligation owed to the Inca state, which allowed rulers to mobilize thousands of workers using rope, log rollers, and earthen ramps. Spanish chroniclers recorded these efforts firsthand, including accounts of workers killed when stones broke loose during transport. Fitting each irregular block into place was likely an iterative process of setting, testing, removing, and grinding down high points until the seam closed to a fraction of a millimeter. After the conquest in 1532, and especially after the 1536 siege of Cusco, Spanish colonists dismantled parts of Sacsayhuaman, hauling away smaller stones to build churches and mansions in the city below, which is why the site looks smaller today than it once did. What survived did so well enough that it remains an active subject of structural research, not folklore. And it's worth being direct about one thing. No credible published research has used artificial intelligence to uncover some secret, inexplicable pattern in this stonework that overturns the archaeological record. What real laser scanning and computational modeling have done is confirm and refine what specialists already understood. And the real explanation gives full credit to human beings, organized at extraordinary scale, applying a trained, repeatable method passed from master to apprentice. That transmission is what was actually lost. The conquest didn't just take stones, it dismantled the labor system and knowledge chains that made this construction possible, and within a couple of generations, the hands-on expertise vanished. Not because it was unwritable or mystical, but because the institutions carrying it forward were violently interrupted. The mystery was never really how this was built. The mystery is how completely we forgot that we already knew. If you want more real research behind ancient engineering that still outperforms modern construction, subscribe and turn on notifications. And if there's a site you want investigated properly, drop it in the comments. I read everyone.